They thought she was just a vegetable, a financial burden, draining their inheritance. When Beatrice and her son Richard stood over Isabella's hospital bed, they weren't praying for a miracle. They were calculating how much money they'd save if they just stopped paying the bills. They laughed as they signed the transfer papers to move her to a decaying state facility, convinced she would never wake up to expose their cruelty. But they made one fatal calculation. They didn't know who Isabella really was. They didn't know about the trust fund, the $850 million empire, or the team of lawyers watching their every move. And they certainly didn't expect her eyes to snap open the moment they walked out the door. The rain battered against the windows of the ICU at St. Jude's Memorial Hospital in Seattle, matching the gloomy atmosphere inside room 402. However, the gloom wasn't caused by the tragedy of the patient lying in the bed. It was caused by the sheer annoyance of the people standing around it. Isabella Vance, a woman of 26, lay motionless. Tubes snaked from her arms and nose, the rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitor, the only evidence that she was still tethered to this world. She had been in a coma for 3 months, following a catastrophic car accident on I-5, an accident where she had swerved to avoid a drunk driver and careened off an embankment. Standing at the foot of the bed were her husband, Richard Vance, and his mother, Beatrice Vance. They were not holding hands. They were not weeping. Beatrice was aggressively tapping a manicured nail against the screen of her iPhone, scrolling through real estate listings. "It's ridiculous, Richard," Beatrice hissed, not bothering to lower her voice. She glanced at Isabella with a look of pure disdain, as if Isabella had decided to slip into a coma, purely to inconvenience Beatrice's social calendar. "Dr. Henderson said there's been minimal brain activity. Do you know what minimal means? It means she's gone. The lights are on, but nobody's home. And meanwhile, this private room is costing us $4,000 a day out of pocket since the insurance cap was hit last week." Richard, a handsome man, whose face was currently marred by a look of weak indecision, sighed. He ran a hand through his hair. "I know, Mother. But she's my wife. It's only been 3 months. 3 months is a fiscal quarter, Richard," Beatrice snapped. She walked over to the window, turning her back on her daughter-in-law. "Look, when you married her, I told you she was dead weight. She was a librarian, for God's sake. A nobody. No family, no connections, just a pretty face and a mountain of student debt. And now she's an anchor, dragging us to the bottom of the ocean. Do you know we might have to cancel the Aspen trip if this continues?" Richard flinched. The Aspen trip was a family tradition. "I haven't given up hope yet," he mumbled, though his voice lacked conviction. The truth was, Richard had checked out weeks ago. He had stopped holding Isabella's hand. He had stopped reading to her. Lately, he had been spending a lot of time with his executive assistant, a fiery blonde named Jessica, who didn't smell like antiseptic and didn't require feeding tubes. "Hope doesn't pay the mortgage on the lake house," Beatrice said coldly. "We need to be practical. I spoke to the hospital administrator, Mr. Clarkson, this morning. There is a state-run facility in Tacoma. It's adequate. It's for indigent patients. Since Isabella has no income and no family other than you, she qualifies for state aid if you stop supplementing her care." "Tacoma." Richard frowned. "That's 2 hours away. And those places, they're basically warehouses for the dying." "She won't know the difference." Beatrice raised her voice, gesturing wildly at the silent figure in the bed. "Look at her. She isn't Isabella anymore. She's a husk. Why should we bankrupt the Vance family legacy for a husk? Think about your future, Richard. Think about us." At that moment, The door opened, and Dr. Henderson walked in. He was a tall, weary-looking neurologist who had grown fond of Isabella during her stay, primarily because her family was so detestable. "Good afternoon," Dr. Henderson said, his eyes narrowing slightly as he sensed the tension. "I was hoping to discuss the latest MRI results." "Is she waking up?" Beatrice asked sharply. "There are fluctuations," Dr. Henderson said carefully. "We've seen some increased activity in the thalamus. It's subtle, but it suggests she might be in a minimally conscious state rather than a vegetative one. She might be able to hear us even if she can't respond." Richard paled, looking at Isabella. "She can hear us. It's possible." The doctor nodded. Beatrice scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Oh, please. That's just medical speak for keep paying the bill. If she could hear us, she'd wake up and apologize for ruining our lives." "Mrs. Vance," Dr. Henderson said, his voice dropping an octave in warning, "I strongly suggest you speak with respect in the patient's presence." "I'll speak how I want about my money," Beatrice retorted. She turned to Richard, grabbing his arm. "Do it, Richard. Sign the transfer papers. Move her to the state facility. We are done bleeding money for a lost cause." Richard looked at the doctor, then at his mother, and finally at his wife. He remembered their wedding day 2 years ago. He remembered promising to love her in sickness and in health. But then he remembered the mounting bills, the pressure from his mother, and the warm, inviting laugh of Jessica, his assistant. "Doctor," Richard said, his voice trembling slightly, "prepare the transfer papers." "Richard, I strongly advise against moving her," Dr. Henderson said, alarmed. "Her condition is fragile. A move to a substandard facility could be fatal." "That's a risk we're willing to take," Beatrice answered for him, a triumphant smile curling her lips. The transfer happened 3 days later. It was a cold, grey Tuesday. They didn't even hire a private ambulance. To save money, Beatrice insisted on a standard transport service that was rough and uncomfortable. Isabella was strapped to a gurney, her body jostled as they wheeled her out of the pristine, quiet halls of St. Jude's and out to the loading dock. Richard didn't ride with her. He claimed he had a board meeting, but in reality he was at a jewelry store in downtown Seattle looking at diamond bracelets for Jessica. He felt a twinge of guilt, a fleeting pang in his chest, but he drowned it out with the justification his mother had fed him. "It's what's best for everyone. Isabella wouldn't want me to suffer." The facility in Tacoma, officially named Oak Creek Extended Care, was a nightmare. It smelled of boiled cabbage, stale urine, and despair. The walls were a peeling beige, and the staff were overworked and underpaid. Isabella was placed in a room with 3 other patients. There was no privacy curtain. The constant groaning of the elderly woman in the bed next to her was a stark contrast to the silence of her private suite at St. Jude's. For the first week, Richard visited once for 10 minutes. He stood by the door, holding a handkerchief to his nose, looking at his watch. "I'm sorry, Izzy," he whispered, though he didn't move closer to her. "But Mom was right. We have to move on." He left, and he didn't come back. Beatrice, however, felt a sense of liberation. With Isabella warehoused, the financial drain stopped. The monthly stipend Richard had been setting aside for Isabella's potential rehabilitation was now freed up. 2 weeks after the transfer, Beatrice sat in the living room of Richard's expansive minimalist mansion. She was sipping a glass of Chardonnay, watching Richard pace the room. "It feels wrong, Mum," Richard said. "I haven't been to see her in 10 days. The nurses at Oak Creek called. They said she developed a fever." "They have doctors there, Richard. Let them handle it." Beatrice dismissed him, flipping through a catalogue for luxury yachts. "Listen to me. You need to focus on the merger. The Vance Group needs your full attention, not your guilt. Besides, I've been thinking about the house. The house, Isabella's things, Beatrice said, waving her hand around the room. Her books, those dreadful paintings she bought, her clothes. It's all clutter. If we're going to redecorate, and Jessica mentioned she loves modern Italian design, we need to purge the old. Richard froze. You want to throw away her stuff? She's not dead, Mum. She might as well be, Beatrice snapped. Stop being so sentimental. Look, I found something interesting while I was clearing out that dusty office she kept in the guest wing. Beatrice reached into her oversized designer bag and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was sealed with red wax, looking oddly old-fashioned and official. What is that? Richard asked. It was in the back of her desk drawer, taped underneath the wood. Hidden. Beatrice said, her eyes gleaming with curiosity. It's addressed to her from a law firm in Switzerland. Garrison Fjord and Associates. Richard frowned, taking the envelope. Switzerland. Isabella didn't know anyone in Switzerland. She was an orphan from Oregon. That's what she told you, Beatrice murmured. Open it. It's addressed to her. She's incapacitated, Richard. You are her power of attorney. Legally, you are her. Open it. Richard hesitated, his thumb hovering over the wax seal. He ripped it open. Inside was a single letter printed on heavy, expensive bond paper. He read it, his eyes scanning the lines. His brow furrowed in confusion. What does it say? Beatrice demanded, leaning forward. It's weird, Richard said. It says, Dear Mrs. Vance, per the instructions of your late grandfather, the restriction period is nearing its end. As of your 27th birthday, the trust requires your in-person signature to unlock the primary assets. Please contact us immediately to arrange the transfer. Until then, the anonymity protocols remain in place. Grandfather, Beatrice snatched the letter from his hand. She said she didn't have a grandfather. She said she was raised in foster care. Tamu. Maybe she was crazy, Richard muttered. Delusional. Made up a fantasy life. Or, Beatrice said slowly, her greedy mind turning gears. She was hiding something. What does primary assets mean? And when is her birthday? Next week, Richard said. November 5th. Beatrice looked at the letter again. Garrison Fjord and Associates. That sounds like money, Richard. Old money. Mom. She was a librarian. She drove a Honda Civic. She clipped coupons. If she had money, why did we have to pay for the wedding? Maybe she was testing you, Beatrice whispered, a horrified realization dawning on her, quickly replaced by avarice. Or maybe she didn't know the extent of it. Richard, if there is money, inheritance money, and you are her husband, then it's marital property. Richard finished a slow grin, spreading across his face. Exactly. Beatrice grinned. We need to find out what this is. Call this law firm. Tell them you are her proxy. But she's in a coma in a state facility, Richard reminded her. The letter says, in-person signature. Details. Beatrice waved him off. If she's unfit, you sign for her. If there's a pot of gold at the end of this rainbow, we are going to take it. We deserve it, Richard. After all the stress she's put us through these past months, it's practically owed to us as compensation. Richard looked at the letter, then at the phone. He dialed the number on the letterhead. While the phone rang miles away in the dark, smelly room at Oak Creek Extended Care. Isabella's finger twitched, just once. Inside the prison of her mind, the fog was lifting. She had heard everything at the hospital. She had heard the betrayal. She had heard the disdain. And now she was fighting her way back. Not for love, not for life, but for war. The phone call to Switzerland changed everything. It took Richard 3 hours to get through the layers of security at Garrison Fjord and Associates. When he finally spoke to a senior partner, a man named Alistair Sterling, whose voice sounded like dry parchment. The reality of the situation hit him like a freight train. Mrs. Vance's grandfather was Elias Thorne. Mr. Sterling explained, his tone devoid of emotion. An industrial magnate who made his fortune in rare earth mining in the 1970s. He was estranged from his daughter Isabella's mother, but he set up the Thorne Sovereign Trust for his only grandchild. He wanted her to mature before accessing the capital. The trust matures on her 27th birthday. And the value? Richard asked, his hand sweating around the phone. Beatrice was leaning in so close, her ear was practically touching his. As of this morning's market opening in Zurich, Sterling said, the liquid assets total $850 million. This does not include the real estate portfolio in London and Macau. Beatrice let out a strangled gasp, clutching her chest as if she were having a heart attack. Richard sat down hard on the sofa. $850 million. It was an amount of money that didn't just buy things. It bought power. It bought immunity. However, Sterling continued, his voice sharpening. The terms are explicit. The beneficiary, Mrs. Isabella Vance, must sign the release documents in the presence of a firm representative. I will be flying to Seattle personally to oversee the transition on November 5th. If she is unable to sign due to incapacity, the trust remains locked for another 5 years. She can sign, Richard said quickly, too quickly. She's recovering. She's doing much better. Excellent. I shall see you both on the 5th. The line went dead. Beatrice sprang up from the sofa, her face flushed with a manic energy. Get the car, Richard. Get the Escalade. We have to go get her. Mom, we just dumped her in a state facility 2 weeks ago. Richard said, his voice rising in panic. What do we tell them? What do we tell her? If she wakes up, we tell her nothing. Beatrice snapped, pacing the room. We tell the facility there was a mistake with the paperwork. We bring her home. We hire the best private nurses money can buy, and we pump her full of whatever vitamins make a person alert for 10 minutes. She just needs to hold a pen, Richard. She just needs to sign her name. And after she signs, Richard asked quietly. Beatrice stopped pacing. She looked at her son with cold, reptilian eyes. After she signs, the money is transferred to a joint account. You are her husband. You have power of attorney. Once the funds are ours, well, her medical care can be re-evaluated. But right now, that girl rotting in Coma is the most valuable asset we own. Go get her. Meanwhile, 40 miles south, Isabella Vance was waking up to hell. Consciousness didn't return all at once. It came in jagged shards. First, the smell ammonia and boiled vegetables. Then the sound a hacking cough from the bed next to her. Finally, the pain. Her body felt stiff, heavy, as if her bones had turned to lead. She opened her eyes. The ceiling was stained with water damage. A fluorescent light flickered intermittently. This wasn't St. Jude's. She remembered the soothing beige walls of St. Jude's. She remembered Dr. Henderson's kind voice. She tried to move her hand and found it strapped to the rail. Panic surged through her, a cold spike of adrenaline. Where was she? A nurse, a heavy-set woman with tired eyes and a stained blue scrub top, walked by. She glanced at Isabella and did a double-take. Well, look who's back with us, the nurse said, her voice rough but not unkind. She walked over and checked Isabella's vitals. Can you hear me, honey? Isabella tried to speak, but her throat was like sandpaper. She managed a raspy croak. "Wa. Ter." The nurse held a cup with a straw to her lips. "Slowly now. You've been out for a long time. You're at Oak Creek Extended Care." Oak Creek. The name meant nothing to her, but the environment told her everything. This was a place for people who had been forgotten. "My husband?" Isabella whispered. The nurse's face softened with pity. "Mr. Vance? He hasn't been here since admission, honey. Just the transport team brought you in. But don't you worry, you're safe here." The memory hit Isabella with the force of a physical blow. The conversation in the hospital room. Beatrice's voice. "She's an anchor, dragging us down." Richard's voice. "Prepare the transfer papers." They had discarded her. They had thrown her away like broken furniture. Isabella closed her eyes, fighting back tears. Tears wouldn't help her now. She was alone, paralyzed, and trapped in a warehouse for the dying. But as the despair threatened to drown her, a spark of fury ignited in her chest. It was small, but it was hot. They thought she was gone. They thought she was a vegetable. "Nurse," Isabella whispered, her voice gaining a tiny fraction of strength. "What is the date?" "It's October 30th, the nurse said. "November 5th, her birthday." The date her grandfather had whispered to her when she was a little girl, before he was forced to hide her away from the world to protect her from his enemies. "Wait until you are 27, Bella. Trust no one until then." She had 5 days. The black Cadillac Escalade pulled up to the crumbling entrance of Oak Creek Extended Care like a spaceship landing on a desolate planet. It was out of place, gleaming and arrogant against the backdrop of grey concrete and rusted railings. Richard Vance stepped out, adjusting his suit jacket. He felt a wave of nausea. The place smelled even worse than he remembered. Beatrice followed him, wearing oversized sunglasses and holding a scented handkerchief to her nose. "This is squalor," she muttered. "How could you leave her here?" "Me," Richard hissed. "This was your idea." "Keep your voice down," she commanded. "Remember the script. We are devastated relatives who have been fighting insurance bureaucracy." They swept into the administration office, startling the receptionist. Beatrice unleashed a torrent of fabricated outrage, claiming that a clerical error at St. Jude's had resulted in this horrific misunderstanding, and that they were taking Isabella home immediately. Money changed hands, a donation to the facility's renovation fund, and the discharge papers were expedited. When they walked into Isabella's room, Richard actually gagged. The air was thick and stale. Isabella lay on the bed, her eyes closed, looking smaller and paler than he had ever seen her. "Isabella," Richard said, his voice trembling with a mix of guilt and performance. "Baby, I'm so sorry. I'm here. We're taking you home." Isabella didn't move. She kept her breathing shallow and even. She had heard their footsteps in the hallway. She had heard Beatrice complaining about the stench of poverty. She knew why they were here. They hadn't come for her. They had come for something she possessed. She just didn't know what it was yet. Is she awake?" Beatrice asked the nurse. "She drifts," the nurse said. "She was lucid earlier this morning. Asked for water." "Good," Beatrice said, masking her relief. "Get the private ambulance crew in here. We need her in the master suite by tonight." The ride back to the Vance estate was a blur of activity. Isabella allowed herself to be lifted, strapped in, and transported. She played the part of the invalid perfectly. She kept her eyes half-lidded, unfocused. She let her limbs hang limp. When they finally settled her into the guest room of the mansion, not the master suite, she noticed Beatrice dismissed the private EMTs and closed the door. Finally, Beatrice exhaled, dropping the act. She walked over to the bed and looked down at Isabella with a critical eye. "She looks terrible. Richard, call that concierge doctor, Dr. Aris. Tell him we need her lucid by Tuesday. Whatever stimulants he has, use them." "She's right there, Mom," Richard whispered. "She's out of it," Beatrice said, waving a hand in front of Isabella's face. Isabella didn't blink. "Listen to me. Tuesday is the 5th. That lawyer Sterling will be here at 10 a.m. We need to prop her up, put a pen in her hand, and guide her signature. Once that paper is signed, the trust unlocks." The trust? Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced her body to remain still. Grandfather. He had really done it. The stories he told her about the Thorn Sovereign Trust weren't fairy tales. They were real, and Richard and Beatrice knew. $850 million, Richard murmured, looking at Isabella with a strange, hungry expression. "I can't believe she was sitting on that the whole time. Why didn't she tell me?" "Because she's secretive," Beatrice spat. "Deceitful, just like her class. But it doesn't matter now. We won. We endured the burden of her. And now we get the payout. It's karma, Richard. We deserve this." Isabella listened to every word. She listened as they discussed buying a new villa in Tuscany. She listened as Richard talked about buying a controlling stake in his competitor's firm. She listened as they carved up her legacy like vultures over a carcass. "Karma," Beatrice had said. Isabella felt a cold, hard resolve settle in her gut. Beatrice was right about one thing. Karma was coming. But it wasn't a reward for them. It was a reckoning. Later that night, when the house was silent and the moon cast long shadows across the room, Isabella opened her eyes fully. She tested her muscles. They were weak, atrophied, but they worked. She slowly moved her hand to the bedside table, where they had carelessly left her personal effects bag from the hospital. Her fingers trembled as she unzipped it. Inside was her old phone. It was dead, obviously. But she knew where Richard kept the charges. She couldn't call the police. Richard was charming, wealthy, and had the law on his side as her husband. They would just say she was confused, brain-damaged. She needed something stronger than the police. She needed the one person her grandfather had told her to contact if things ever went wrong. She needed to get to the library. There was a hidden safe behind the faux bookshelf that Richard, who never read a book in his life, didn't know existed. Isabella swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her feet hit the floor and her knees buckled. She bit her lip to keep from crying out. She dragged herself up, using the nightstand for support. She wasn't the librarian anymore. She wasn't the trophy wife. She was the granddaughter of Elias Thorne, the Wolf of the West, and the wolf was hungry. Dragging one foot in front of the other, she crept toward the door. She had 4 days until the meeting. 4 days to regain her strength. 4 days to set a trap that would destroy them both. The hallway was a mile long. At least that's how it felt to Isabella as she dragged her weakened body across the hardwood floors. Every shadow looked like Richard. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like Beatrice's heels clicking against the wood. She reached the library, a massive room filled with leather-bound books that Richard bought by the yard for aesthetics, but never opened. The irony wasn't lost on her. Richard saw books as decoration. Isabella saw them as armor. She crawled behind the heavy mahogany desk, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She reached up and pulled a specific book from the bottom shelf, a first edition of The Count of Monte Cristo. It was a gift from her grandfather, Elias Thorne, hidden in plain sight among the meaningless decor. Behind the book wasn't a wall, but a small biometric keypad embedded in the wood paneling. Her thumb hovered over the scanner. "Please work," she prayed. "Please don't let the coma have changed my print." A soft beep followed by a mechanical whir. A small panel slid open, revealing a safe no larger than a shoebox. Inside sat a satellite phone, a stack of cash, and a vial of clear liquid. Isabella grabbed the phone. It was an older model, rugged and heavy, designed to work off the grid. She pressed the single speed dial button programmed into it. It rang once, twice. "Status," a voice answered. It wasn't a receptionist. It was Alistair Sterling himself. "It's me." Isabella rasped, her voice stronger now, fueled by adrenaline. There was a pause on the line, a heavy, pregnant silence. Then a sigh of relief that sounded like wind moving through dry leaves. "Mrs. Vance, we were monitoring the hospital logs. We saw the transfer to the state facility. We were preparing an extraction team when the transfer order to the residence came through. Are you safe?" "I'm in the house," Isabella whispered, leaning her head against the desk. "They know about the trust. Beatrice found the letter. They brought me back to force me to sign." "I anticipated as much," Sterling said, his voice cold and professional. "Elias warned that your husband's ambition exceeded his intellect. They believe I am coming on the 5th to facilitate the transfer of funds to them." "They think I'm brain damaged," Isabella said. "They plan to guide my hand to sign the papers. Sterling, they abandoned me. They threw me away to save money." "We know," Sterling said gently. "We have the bank records. We saw the cessation of payments to St. Jude's. We saw the liquidation of your personal assets. It is all documented. I want to burn them down, Alistair," Isabella said, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a dark, consuming rage. "I don't just want a divorce. I want them to feel what I felt. I want them to lose everything." "Then do not sign the transfer papers," Sterling commanded. "But do not fight them yet. You must play the part. Let them believe they have won. Let them invite their witnesses. Let them set the stage. On Tuesday, I will arrive with the paperwork. But it will not be the paperwork they expect. What do I do until then?" "There is a vial in the safe," Sterling said. "It is a counter-agent. If they try to drug you, and they will ingest this beforehand. It will neutralize the sedatives and keep your mind sharp while allowing your body to appear sluggish. Can you do that?" Isabella looked at the small vial. "I can do anything to see them fall." "Good. Stay hidden, Isabella. The wolf is at the door." Isabella swallowed the liquid from the vial. It tasted like bitter almonds and hid the phone back in the safe. She closed the panel, replaced the book, and began the agonizing crawl back to her room. She made it back to the bed just as the handle of her bedroom door turned. She threw herself under the covers, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She let her jaw go slack, her eyes half open and unseeing. Richard walked in. He was wearing silk pajamas, holding a glass of scotch. He stood over her, swaying slightly. The smell of expensive liquor and hesitation wafted off him. "Izzy," he whispered. She didn't move. She stared at a spot on the wall, regulating her breathing to be slow and shallow. "I really am sorry," he slurred, taking a sip of the drink. "But 850 million. Think of what we could do. We could be royalty, Izzy. You wouldn't want me to be a failure, would you? You always supported me. This is just one last sacrifice." He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face. Isabella took every ounce of her willpower not to bite his finger off. "It's for the best," he muttered, convincing himself. "You're not really here anyway." He turned and left, closing the door softly. In the dark, Isabella smiled. It was a terrifying expression. "I'm here, Richard," she thought. "And on Tuesday, I'm going to introduce you to the person you really married." The morning of November the 5th arrived with a grey, ominous sky. The Vance estate was buzzing with nervous energy. Beatrice had hired a cleaning crew to scrub the house from top to bottom, wanting everything to look perfect for the arrival of the Swiss lawyers. At 8:00 a.m., the door to Isabella's room burst open. Beatrice marched in, followed by a short, sweating man carrying a medical bag. This was Dr. Aris, a concierge doctor known in Seattle's high society for writing prescriptions for anything if the price was right. "Wake her up," Beatrice ordered. Dr. Aris approached the bed. "Mrs. Vance, can you hear me?" Isabella moaned softly, rolling her head to the side. "She's catatonic," Beatrice snapped. "Just give her the shot. We need her awake enough to hold a pen, but compliant enough not to ask questions. A heavy dose of amphetamines mixed with a mild sedative." Dr. Aris nodded, filling a syringe. "It's the executive cocktail. She'll be essentially a puppet for about 4 hours." Isabella felt the needle prick her arm. She didn't flinch. Thanks to the counteragent Sterling had given her, the drugs would have a minimal effect, merely making her feel like she had drunk too much coffee. But she let her eyelids flutter. She let her head loll back. "Perfect," Beatrice said, checking her diamond-encrusted Rolex. "Get her dressed. Put her in that white dress, the one that makes her look innocent, and wheel her into the drawing room." An hour later, Isabella was positioned in a wheelchair in the center of the grand drawing room. She was dressed like a doll, her hair brushed and pinned. She stared blankly at the fireplace, observing everything through her peripheral vision. Richard was pacing nervously, adjusting his tie. Beatrice was arranging a tray of champagne flutes. "Stop pacing, Richard," Beatrice scolded. "You look guilty." "I'm nervous, Mother. What if the lawyer asks her questions?" "He won't. I looked up this Alistair Sterling. He's a corporate shark. He cares about fees and signatures, not ethics. As long as the ink hits the paper, he gets his commission." The doorbell rang. It was a deep, resonant chime that echoed through the house. "That's them," Beatrice said, smoothing her skirt. "Showtime." But it wasn't the lawyers. The housekeeper opened the door, and in walked Jessica. She was wearing a tight red dress that was entirely inappropriate for the morning, let alone a legal meeting. She carried a designer handbag and wore a look of utter entitlement. "Jessica!" Richard hissed, rushing over to her. "What are you doing here? I told you to stay at the condo." "I couldn't wait, Richie." She giggled loud and shrill. "Beatrice told me today is payday. I wanted to be here when we become billionaires." Beatrice walked over, not looking angry, but conspiratorial. "I invited her, Richard. Jessica is part of the family now. Or she will be once she is gone." Beatrice gestured carelessly toward Isabella. Isabella watched them. She saw Jessica drape her arms around Richard's neck. She saw Richard kiss her right there in the living room, 10 feet away from his comatose wife. "Is that her?" Jessica asked, looking at Isabella with a sneer. "She looks creepy." "She's a checkbook darling," Beatrice said. "Nothing more. Just ignore her." "Can I have her car?" Jessica asked, wandering over to Isabella and poking her shoulder with a manicured finger. The Audi, since she won't be needing it. You can have a Bentley by tonight, Richard promised, his greed overriding his discomfort. Just let us get through this meeting. The doorbell rang again. This time the atmosphere shifted. The air in the room grew colder. The housekeeper opened the double doors, and Alistair Sterling entered. He was a man who commanded immediate respect. He was older, perhaps 60, with silver hair and a suit that cost more than Richard's car. He didn't come alone. Flanking him were two large men in dark suits who stood by the door, and a younger associate carrying a briefcase that looked heavy enough to contain gold bars. "Mr. Sterling," Beatrice said, stepping forward with her most charming smile, extending a hand. "Welcome to our home." Sterling ignored her hand. He walked past her, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Isabella. His expression remained stone. "Mr. Vance, Mrs. Vance." Sterling nodded to Beatrice. "And," he looked at Jessica, "this is—" "A family friend," Richard stammered. "Jessica." "I see," Sterling said dryly. He placed the briefcase on the coffee table. "Shall we proceed? My schedule is tight." "Yes, absolutely," Beatrice said, guiding Sterling to the seating area. "As you can see, poor Isabella is struggling. Her accident was tragic, but she is awake." Beatrice pinched Isabella's arm hard, hidden by the wheelchair armrest. Isabella let out a small gasp. "See?" Beatrice smiled. "She's with us." Sterling stared at Beatrice for a long moment. It was a look that would have withered a lesser woman, but Beatrice was too blinded by dollar signs to notice the danger. "The terms of the Thorn Sovereign Trust are specific," Sterling said, unlocking the briefcase. "The beneficiary must sign acknowledging receipt of the assets. Once signed, the funds are irrevocable." "Perfect," Richard said, sweating. "Where does she sign?" Sterling laid out a document. It was thick bound in blue legal paper. He took out a heavy fountain pen, a Mont Blanc, and uncapped it. "Here." Sterling pointed to the bottom line. "And here." Beatrice moved behind the wheelchair. She grabbed Isabella's right hand. "Come on, Isabella. Be a good girl. Sign for Richard." Isabella let her hand be moved. She felt the cold barrel of the pen against her fingers. Richard and Jessica were holding hands, leaning in their eyes wide with avarice. Beatrice was practically vibrating with excitement. This was it, the moment they had killed for, the moment they had sold their souls for. Beatrice forced Isabella's hand down toward the paper. "Just a scribble, dear," Beatrice whispered in her ear. "Just your name." Isabella's hand touched the paper, but instead of the shaky, illegible scrawl, Beatrice expected Isabella's grip on the pen tightened. The tip of the pen dug into the paper. Isabella stopped acting. She lifted her head slowly. The slack-jawed expression vanished, replaced by a look of cold, razor-sharp intelligence. She turned her head and looked directly into Beatrice's eyes. "No," Isabella said. The word was soft, but it hit the room like a gunshot. Beatrice froze. "What?" Isabella ripped her hand from Beatrice's grip. She sat up straight in the wheelchair, her spine rigid. She looked at Richard, who had turned a ghostly shade of white. She looked at Jessica, whose mouth was hanging open. "I said," Isabella repeated, her voice clear, strong, and dripping with ice. "No. She's having a reaction to the medicine," Richard shouted, panic rising. "She's delirious." "I am perfectly lucid, Richard," Isabella said, standing up. She rose from the wheelchair. Her legs were shaky, but she stood tall. She smoothed down the white dress they had put her in. "You," Beatrice gasped, stepping back. "You can walk." "I can walk," Isabella said, taking a step toward them. I can talk. And I can hear. I heard you at the hospital. I heard you at the nursing home. I heard you discussing the villa in Tuscany. And I heard you promise my car to your mistress. She turned to Sterling. Mr. Sterling, Isabella said, calm. Are the other documents ready? They are, madam, Sterling said. He reached into the briefcase and pulled out a second stack of papers, red ones. What is going on? Richard screamed. What documents? These, Isabella said, picking up the red folder, are the divorce papers, and the criminal complaint for attempted fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud and elder abuse. You can't do this, Beatrice shrieked. We are your family. No. Isabella smiled, and it was the smile of the wolf. You were my burden, and I am finally liquidating my assets. Isabella looked at the two large security men by the door. Gentlemen, she said, please ensure that my husband and his mother do not leave the premises. The police are on their way. The single word no hung in the air of the drawing room, heavier than the crystal chandelier above them. It was a soft word, spoken without shouting, yet it carried enough force to shatter the reality Richard and Beatrice had constructed. For 10 agonizing seconds, nobody moved. The scratching sound of the pen tip digging into the expensive legal paper was the only noise. Then Isabella slowly lifted her hand. She didn't let the pen drop. She placed it deliberately on the table with a sharp click, staring directly into the eyes of her mother-in-law. You, Beatrice stammered, her face draining of color, leaving her makeup looking like a grotesque mask. You're having a spasm. Richard, grab her hand. The drugs are making her twitch. Richard lunged forward, his face slick with the sweat of greed. Izzy, honey, stop it. You're confused. Just let Mum help you. Do not touch me, Isabella said. Her voice wasn't the croak of a coma patient anymore. It was low, resonant, and vibrating with a cold, terrifying clarity. She turned her head slowly, the vertebrae cracking audibly in the silence, and locked eyes with her husband. If you touch me, Richard, she said, enunciating every syllable, I will have Mr. Sterling add assault to the list of charges already waiting in that briefcase. Richard froze his hand, hovering inches from her arm. He looked at Isabella, really looked at her for the first time in months. The dull, vacant look was gone. Her eyes were sharp, predatory, and burning with a fire that terrified him. You're awake, Richard whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. Fully awake. I have been awake since you discussed turning my guest room into a walk-in closet for your mistress, Isabella replied calmly. She shifted in the wheelchair, gripping the armrests. I was awake when you joked about the stench of poverty at the nursing home, and I was certainly awake when you pawned my engagement ring last Tuesday to put a down payment on that Porsche you thought I wouldn't notice. Jessica, standing by the fireplace, let out a strangled squeak. I didn't know, she cried out, her voice shrill. Richard told me you were a vegetable. He said you were gone, and you were so eager to step into a dead woman's shoes, Isabella said, turning her gaze to the mistress. Her eyes dropped to Jessica's ears. Speaking of shoes, you might want to take off those diamond earrings. They belong to my great-grandmother Elias Thorne's wife. In the state of Washington, possession of stolen property over 5,000 is a Class B felony. Those are worth 50. Jessica's hands flew to her ears, fumbling with the clasps as she backed away from Richard. I'm taking them off. Here, I don't want any part of this. Silence! Beatrice shrieked, slamming her hand on the table. She wasn't ready to surrender. She was a Vance, and Vances didn't lose. This is a farce, so she's awake. Fine, that makes this easier. Isabella, stop being dramatic. We are your family. We saved you from that state facility. We brought you home. You brought me home to harvest my signature, Isabella corrected her. We are legally entitled to manage your assets. Beatrice yelled, her chest heaving. Richard is your husband, and frankly, after the medical bills we've paid, you owe us. Now sign the transfer papers, or I will have Dr. Aris declare you mentally unstable. We have a doctor right here who will testify you are hallucinating. She turned to Dr. Aris, but the concierge doctor was already backing toward the door, clutching his medical bag. I just administer B12 shots, he stammered, realizing the wind had shifted. I didn't know anything about a trust fund. I'm leaving. Sit down, doctor. Alistair Sterling spoke up. His voice was like a grand piano lid slamming shut. The doors are locked, and the federal agents currently setting up a perimeter outside would likely want to speak to the man who administered a non-consensual narcotic cocktail to a recovering trauma patient. Dr. Aris collapsed into a chair, putting his head in his hands. Beatrice turned on Sterling, her lips curling into a snarl. You work for us now. We are the ones who called you. We are the ones paying the commission. Actually, Sterling said, adjusting his silk tie with agonizing slowness. I work for the Thorn Sovereign Trust, and by extension, Mrs. Vance. My loyalty is to the bloodline, not the marriage license. Sterling reached into his briefcase and pulled out the red folder. He laid it on the table next to the unsigned transfer papers. Mr. Vance, Sterling said, looking at Richard. Do you recall the mortgage refinancing paperwork you signed 2 years ago? The one your mother insisted was standard boilerplate to lower your interest rate. I signed a lot of things, Richard stammered, wiping sweat from his eyes. What does that have to do with this? You didn't read page 44, clause 12, subsection C, Sterling said, opening the red folder. It is known as the bad faith joinder. Elias Thorne was a paranoid man, Richard. He knew his granddaughter had a kind heart, and he feared she would be exploited by fortune hunters. So he built a trap into her estate planning. Sterling slid a document across the table. It wasn't a transfer of Isabella's money. It was a seizure order. The clause states, Sterling read aloud, that if the spouse of the beneficiary is found to have acted with malice, neglect, or intent to defraud the beneficiary during a period of incapacitation, the spouse forfeits all marital assets to the trust as restitution for emotional and physical damages. Richard stared at the paper. The words swam before his eyes. Forfeits. All. Everything, Isabella said softly. She slowly stood up from the wheelchair. Her legs trembled slightly, but she locked her knees, standing tall in the white dress they had forced her into. She looked like an avenging angel. The Vance Group, your personal savings, the lake house, the cars, and, of course, this estate. This is my house, Beatrice screamed, lunging at the table as if to tear up the papers. Before she could reach them, one of the large security guards moved with blurring speed, catching Beatrice by the wrist. He twisted it behind her back, forcing her down onto the Persian rug she loved so much. "Get your hands off me," she screeched. "Richard, do something." But Richard was paralyzed. He was watching his life disintegrate. "You can't do this, Izzy." He wept, tears finally spilling over. "I'm your husband. I love you." "Love?" Isabella laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Love is sitting by a hospital bed, holding a hand. Love is fighting for someone when they can't fight for themselves. Love is not calculating how much money you save by moving your wife to a place where rats live in the walls. She took a step closer to him. You didn't love me, Richard. You loved that I was quiet. You loved that I was a librarian who didn't ask questions. You loved that I made you feel like a big man because you thought you rescued me from poverty. She leaned in her face, inches from his. But you didn't rescue me. You just didn't know I was a sleeping dragon. I was weak, Richard sobbed, dropping to his knees and grabbing the hem of her dress. Mom made me do it. She said we were going broke. She said you were dead weight. I didn't want to hurt you. You coward, Beatrice spat from the floor, her face pressed against the rug. Blaming your mother. You were the one buying jewelry for that tramp while your wife was in a coma. I'm not a tramp, Jessica yelled, throwing the diamond earrings onto the table. And I'm definitely not going to jail for you losers. Jessica made a run for the French doors leading to the garden. She threw them open only to find 3 uniformed police officers waiting on the patio arms crossed. The front doors burst open at the same time. A team of detectives swarmed into the room, their radios crackling. The air filled with the chaotic noise of justice rights being read, handcuffs clicking, and the wails of the entitled realizing they were no longer untouchable. Richard Vance, Beatrice Vance, the lead detective announced, stepping over the threshold. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, embezzlement, and elder abuse. Murder! Richard shrieked as they hauled him up. I never tried to kill her. Withholding medical care with the intent to cause death is constructive homicide, Sterling noted dryly, closing his briefcase. And moving a critical patient to a facility unequipped to handle her care constitutes depraved indifference. You tried to kill her, Richard. You just didn't want to get your hands bloody. As the officers dragged Beatrice out, she was still screaming about her social standing, threatening to sue the police department, the city and God himself. Richard, however, went limp. As they pulled him past Isabella, he dug his heels in, looking at her one last time. His eyes were red, pathetic, and filled with a profound regret. Izzy, he choked out. 850 million. We could have had it all. Why? Why didn't you just tell me who you were? Isabella signaled the officers to pause. She leaned in close to his ear, whispering the final secret that would haunt him in his cell for the rest of his life. Because, Richard, she whispered, my grandfather taught me that money is a magnifying glass. It shows you who people really are. If I had told you about the money, I would have seen your mask. By saying nothing, I saw your soul, and it was black. She pulled back and nodded to the officers. Get him out of my house. They dragged him away, his sobbing echoing down the marble hallway until the heavy front doors slammed shut, sealing the silence. Isabella stood alone in the center of the wreckage. The room was empty now, save for Sterling and the security detail. The air felt lighter, cleaner. The deed is done, Mrs. Vance, Sterling said gently. The assets have been frozen. The transfer of the Vance properties to your name is already electronic. You are now the sole owner of everything they once took pride in. Isabella walked over to the window. She watched the police cruisers flashing red and blue lights against the grey sky. She saw Jessica being placed in the back of one car, and Richard and Beatrice in another. Burn it, Isabella said softly. Sterling raised an eyebrow. The house, madame? No. Isabella turned a small, genuine smile finally touching her lips. Burn their things, their clothes, their portraits, their furniture. I want this house empty by tomorrow. I'm going to fill it with books, and I'm going to turn the guest wing, the one they put me in, to die into a rehabilitation center for people who can't afford care. A noble choice, Sterling bowed. Your grandfather would be proud. The wolf's blood runs true. Isabella looked at her reflection in the darkened window. She didn't look like a victim. She didn't look like a survivor. She looked like a queen who had just reconquered her kingdom. I'm not the wolf Alistair, she said, watching the last police car disappear down the long driveway. The wolf attacks to kill. I waited. I watched. And I let them destroy themselves. She turned back to the room, her eyes gleaming. I'm the Coma they didn't believe in. And that is how Isabella Vance turned a tragedy into a triumph. Beatrice and Richard thought they could treat people like disposable objects because they believed their money and status made them untouchable. They thought kindness was a weakness and silence was surrender. But they forgot the most important rule of life. Karma never loses an address. They spent their lives worshipping money, only to lose everything: their freedom, their reputation, and their fortune to the very person they threw away. Isabella proved that true power isn't about how loudly you shout or how much you spend. It's about patience, intelligence, and the strength to stand up when everyone expects you to stay down. If you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who needs a reminder that karma is real, and subscribe for more incredible stories of betrayal and revenge. Thanks for watching.